So welcome to everyone, and many thanks to those of you who are returning after the previous two talks. As Rachel said, what we are presenting in these three talks is research that has been done by the Miniare project, and for those of you who haven't encountered it yet, it is a project which allows us to interrogate manuscripts from very many different points of view with different methodologies and different techniques. We look at the pigments which allow the artist to produce this resplendent palette. We look at the techniques which they used to allow us still to enjoy these manuscripts today, almost as fresh and beautiful as if they were painted yesterday. We also look at how the artists worked, how they collaborated, how they competed with one another, what their relationships might have been with the patrons who commissioned these works of art, and who were these people and how they used these books. What can we glean from the material evidence left within the manuscripts that would tell us when, where, how, by whom, and for whom they were created. So one of the manuscripts that we are subjecting to this cross-interrogation is the so-called Grandeur of Philip the Bold. It is a truly grand manuscript in every respect. It's big as a Book of Hours could possibly be. And the Book of Hours was the standard prayer book in the late medieval period and throughout the Renaissance. But they usually come in smaller, portable sizes. This is a big, hefty volume. It is in two parts today because it grew so big thanks to subsequent dukes adding prayers and images to it in the course of a century that in the end it was split up into two. What you see on the left is our manuscript here at the Fitzwilliam, which is the more richly illuminated. And what you see on the right is the other half, which is today in Brussels in the Royal Library, and that has a few smaller images. The manuscript was produced in two main campaigns. The first one was initiated by Philip the Bold, which is why we call it the Grandeur of Philip the Bold. Philip the Bold was the founder of the Burgundian dynasty and the founder of the Burgundian Library. He was the son of JeanLoup, John II, King of France. He was the brother of the next King of France, Charles V, and he was the uncle of the next King of France, Charles VI. So a son, brother, and uncle, and advisor, regent, counselor for three successive kings of France, very much member of the Valois dynasty, very much member of the French royal family. And he had himself and other members of the family painted throughout the manuscript in small images like this one, here, 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 but also on the opening page he painted himself in this little initial, raising his hands in prayer to the Annunciation, the main miniature above, and presumably the book open in front of him is this very book. Philip commissioned the manuscript in the 1370s, and we are very fortunate to have the ducal accounts which survive for that period. We know that he commissioned it in 1376 and paid for it in 1379. So in those 4 years, over 150 images were painted. What happened next was the manuscript passed into the hands of Philip's grandson, another Philip, Philip the Good of Burgundy, probably the most famous Burgundian duke. And what this Philip did was he added numerous texts and images to the manuscript. The two volumes together have over 200 miniatures. And we see a very notable difference between the two dukes. Philip the Bold painted himself in miniatures, small format, very modestly, usually outside the main depiction of the sacred event. Philip the Good, I needed the pointer. Philip the Good painted himself right inside the miniature, which shows the Mass of St. Gregory, a very famous miracle, which had taken place about 10 centuries earlier. But there you see him right there, kneeling on his armorial carpet, in his fashionable hairstyle and haute couture, black brocade, fur-trimmed, and he's wearing the collar of the Order of the Golden Fleece, which he had founded in 1430. Philip started adding to the manuscript around 1440 and didn't stop until 1451. By then the book had become too big, too thick, too unwieldy. He recognized that it had to be split up in two, and he actually paid for its rebinding in 2 volumes. So the 2 volumes now in Cambridge and Brussels. What I want to do very briefly is give you a sketch of each of the 4 main artists who worked on the original Parisian campaign, and then hand over to Paola, who will shine some light on their secrets as to materials and techniques. Why is this manuscript so important? Not just for us because it happens to be one of our finest French manuscripts. It is probably the grandest manuscript still surviving that Philip the Bold ever commissioned. It is terribly important because it showcases some of the major developments in mid-14th century Parisian painting and illumination. And these are, of course, we always judge art looking back from where we are now. But if you imagine yourself in Paris in the 1370s, I'll just point to the 3 novelties which would have been absolutely breathtakingly staggering for art patrons at the time. And these are the developments that took place at the French court among artists who worked for the French royal family and then were disseminated outside. So these include the new interest in portraiture, which we just saw, those numerous portraits, which is the first attempt, mid-14th century Paris, to begin to paint people with some similitude to veracity, to real sort of individualized portraiture. The second is the interest in landscape, and up until this point, what you have as backgrounds are these very beautiful but completely abstract patterns, and you can still see the remnants of them because the sky is not real, the sky is that background. However, the landscape is already intruding. It's taking in some of the miniatures most of the backdrop. And by the end of the century, the ornamental patterns will disappear, and by the early 1400s, we will be getting real sky and real sun and real stars. So that is another major development. And finally, there is a new technique. And this painting technique consists of an approach that we normally associate with the Impressionists, this pointillistic stippling, where the brushstrokes are not only directional, so when you look at the way the brushwork is done, it simulates the movement of the fabrics, but it's also these dots of white and blue in different saturations, which create the illusion of moving luminosity. And of course our theme for the Science Festival is light. What artists try to convey through these optical mixtures, so it's not just mixtures of different pigments, they're optical mixtures that our eye produces as we look at the artwork. And they create this illusion of movement and scintillating, dynamic shifting of fabrics and textures, the way the fabrics move and shift and capture the light. So artists in the 14th century were very adept at that. We don't need to wait for the 19th century to see stunning examples of pointillism. So I'll go very briefly through the artists. So there are 4 major artists who produced these 150 images in the Parisian campaign of the 1370s. The first one, who only painted this miniature, the opening image of the Annunciation, together with Phillip the Bold sported here, and I don't know how well you can see the remnants of the coats of arms, the Burgundian coats of arms, supported by two lions on either side, deleted by a later owner. This is an artist who has been named after a manuscript now in Paris that had been made for Philip's father, JeanLoup. He's known as the master of the Bible of Jean de C. He painted a Bible for John the Good. The Bible was left unfinished, presumably because John the Good was captured at Agincourt and stopped payment. And of course, we're not celebrating Waterloo this year. We are celebrating Agincourt. 1415 is when, so the English have a lot to celebrate this year. So when John the Good was captured, that Bible was left unfinished, but there we see different stages of the work of this artist. And he is truly remarkable in the way he conceives of space. What you see here is an Italian-style loggia. And look how subtly he had differentiated the pink on the front side of the loggia, which is presumably lit by the source of light. And he had darkened it on the side to create the sense of three-dimensionality and depth. The most interesting thing for me personally is the dynamic of the personalities, the protagonists, the way they engage. So the angel clearly addressing the Virgin with the Annunciation message, but he's also cross-referring to God above, where the message really comes from. God had dispatched not only Gabriel, he had dispatched the dove of the Holy Spirit, which is just about touching the halo of the Virgin, the moment of conception, of Christ's conception. And you can see that the Virgin is not exactly happy. She is rather demure and kind of reluctant, kind of obedient, kind of accepting, but not exactly sure. The angel seems very eager to convey the message and get the job done. And the way the wings are painted on this miniature is absolutely breathtaking. So this is our first artist. Our second and main artist, the artist who painted the 9 out of the 11 large miniatures in this campaign, we've actually named after this manuscript. We've named him the Master of the Grandeurs. He is found in other books, but this is probably his grandest product. And he is a disciple of the Jean de master. He is a disciple of the artist who painted the Annunciation. He has the same color scheme, blue combined, very deep, beautiful blue, combined with striking spots of very, very bold orange. You can see the orange kind of dotted here and there. But then this very opaque and bold palette is contrasted with very subtle tones. You can see the pink, very subtle pink here on the Virgin, these beautiful grays and kind of violets, violet, gray, blue shades, and a pastel green. So it's a pastel, soft, gentle palette contrasted with very bold blue and orange. He combines the stippling effect with the directional brush strokes, and the modeling of fabrics is very similar. So he is a truly faithful disciple of the main artist. And then the third artist painted only one large image, this one, the Throne of Mercy, so we've named him the Master of the Throne of Mercy after this image. He painted numerous small miniatures as well. He follows the same color scheme, but his modeling is not as sophisticated and subtle as that of the previous two artists. He uses no stippling, just directional brush strokes, and his drawing is very linear and dry, and that is in a way his charm, but he is quite different, and Paola will highlight some differences in his materials as well. And finally, the last artist, the fourth master, who did not paint a single large miniature. He painted 18 small images, and he's known as the master of the Coronation book of Charles V. He's named after this manuscript on your right, from which I'm showing you just details here. This is the Coronation book which Charles V commissioned in commemoration of his coronation ceremony in 1364. The manuscript is now in the British Library, and the artist who painted this is our last master. And he was very good at using very strong and bright and bold palette. He was very good at decorative details. He was less good at faces. He seems to paint these rather odd, vacant, almost beast-like expressions, and you could probably see it best in this detail here with the flat, large, highlighted nose and the eyes set quite far apart on either side, which kind of confers this sort of almost beastly expression to his faces. He was a favorite of Charles V. He painted lots and lots of manuscripts for him throughout the 1350s and 1360s. And we see with our manuscript that he was still active in the 1370s, but he was no longer in his prime. Or probably whoever was in charge managing the production of our manuscript was less than impressed by the artist's waning talents. So he was only assigned those 18 small miniatures. Why? He was the favorite artist of the king. They had 150 miniatures to paint in 4 years, so they needed some help. His reputation was probably still up and running. Maybe he butted in, he wanted to be involved. But the most interesting thing to us is to what extent did he collaborate with the other 3 artists who seem to be borrowing the same models, the same patterns, the same compositions, even the same figures. They're repeating the same patterns throughout their miniatures with more or less variation. He seems to stand apart. He is not really collaborating with them. He's doing his own thing. So there is a sense of collaboration throughout the manuscript. There is also a sense of competition. So I will now hand over to Paola, who has a lot more intricate detail for you relating to all those 4 artists and how they work together.
Thank you, Stella, and good afternoon, everybody. Following Stella's introduction, I really don't need to say much about the manuscript at all. So I will just briefly present the experimental approach that we used and give some details about the analytical methods we employed to identify the pigments and painting techniques on this manuscript. But before I do that, let me say once again that the main theme for the Science Festival this year is light. And that's because 2015 is the UNESCO Year of Light and Light-Based Technologies. So we thought it was appropriate to underline this and to say that basically all of the analytical methods that we are employing make use of light, or more broadly speaking, of electromagnetic radiation in different wavelengths. And as you can imagine, the variety of painting materials and techniques that we expect to encounter on a manuscript such as this really does require the use of multiple analytical methods. And so in the case of this manuscript in particular, we did make extensive use of X-rays in the form of X-ray fluorescence, and also of infrared light in the form of near-infrared imaging. And I'll discuss these in more details, in more detail. And these 2 analytical methods in particular allowed the visualization of underdrawing and preparatory sketches, of which you see an example here, and I'll show more in the next few slides. And also they really help to identify painting materials, and particularly the pigments used by the illuminators, the 4 artists who share the workload on this book. Now to take infrared images of the miniatures in this manuscript, we used a so-called multispectral imaging system, which actually allows us to acquire a series of 12 images of the same area at different wavelengths. And you can see some here, 8 of those 12 images for this detail. And you can see how, as we proceed, I'll show it again, from the visible into the near infrared, more and more paint layers become transparent, and we see a lot of the drawing that's actually underneath. And this really helps in characterize the style for each of the 4 artists. Now, the X-ray fluorescence analysis instead was carried out our micro XRF instrument. It's micro XRF, but it's a macro instrument. It's definitely the largest of the scientific instruments we own. And before describing the results of the XRF analysis, I just want to spend a few minutes discussing the setup that we used to analyze this book, because this is a book that opens remarkably well, as you can probably see here, but is still a bound volume with all the constraints that this poses on the setup. So in general, if we're analyzing manuscript cuttings, as you heard, for those of you who were here last week when Dr. Bertolotti gave a talk on manuscript cuttings, she did highlight the challenges of analyzing a cutting because of the lack of context. But we can say that they're easier to analyze from the practical point of view because they're just like small panel paintings. So they're just a flat surface, and we can put pretty much any scientific instrument right in front of them without much trouble. When we're dealing with bound books, we have to get creative. So using all kinds of supports so that the book and the instrument that we're using work well together in a way that's absolutely safe for the manuscript. And the instrument is not actually touching the book. You can't tell from the image. But there's a few millimeters in between the two. So it's really a micrometric almost precision that we need to achieve. And here's another example. Many of the instruments we use have these so-called superheads, which are mounted on poles and usually have lots of fibers, because that really allows us to get really close to the manuscript without touching it. And in other cases, in this case, we had to turn the instrument upside down because otherwise this portion would have hit the book. The portion of the book that we were not analyzing. So again, it's all a matter sometimes really of being creative and making sure we support the book in the best possible way. But with the micro XRF instrument that we have, the main challenge was that X-rays, which is what we use for XRF analysis, are very penetrating. So they will penetrate through the paint layers in the miniature, through the parchment, through whatever's underneath on the verse of that page, and through all of, a few of these pages here. So lest we get a very confusing signal, which we wouldn't know how to interpret, we really need to make sure we separate as much of this background signal as we can from the signal coming from the miniature we are analyzing. So in this case, we chose to use a little block of Perspex, about 1 centimeter thick. We placed it on tissue paper so as not to damage the surface underneath. And that, unfortunately, still means we have to deal with whatever text or image is on the verso of this folio, but there's nothing we can do about that. We just have to make sure we keep that in mind when we interpret our spectrum. So overall, throughout the grandeur, we identified a very homogeneous palette, really, regardless of the different artists painting each miniature. Ultramarine blue was used in all the blue areas. Indigo and orpiment, so a blue and a yellow pigment, were mixed in green areas to make what is usually called Virgo, which is again a mixed green. And these were used, Virgo was using green robes, trees, and also for dark gray and green landscapes, the ones that Stella showed in some of the miniatures earlier. Minium or red lead was used for orange areas, and organic dyes were used for pink areas. And we're actually able to identify 2 different types of organic dyes. One insect-based, using these sort of lighter pink areas, and then a lichen-based dye used in sort of darker background areas such as this. Now, I won't describe in detail how we identified all of these pigments, but let me just give you a couple of examples to show you how the different techniques we employed really worked well together. As I said, XRF, X-ray fluorescence analysis, really was helpful on this manuscript. And this is an example of an XRF spectrum of a green area, the tree up here. And the most important thing for me is to see this peak down here, which tells me that there is arsenic. And arsenic, the presence of arsenic is indicative of an arsenic sulfide, which is a yellow or sometimes an orange pigment. Separate analysis by Raman spectroscopy told us that this was actually orpiment, so a very specific form of arsenic sulfide, which again is a yellow pigment. But this spectrum doesn't really say anything about what else is in that green. It can't just be yellow, of course. There must be either a green or a blue pigment to make up that green area. And XRF unfortunately isn't helping us. And that's where reflectance spectroscopy came in, another of the methods we were using, because the spectra of green areas have a very specific shape, especially here. This is the visible range. And this specific shape with sort of a dip at about 650 nanometers is indicative of indigo or woad. So that's the blue component in these green areas, and that's how we can say that there is a mixture of orpiment and indigo to make up these greens. And again, in the case of purple areas, again, these are mixed. And in fact, if you look at this image of this is a photomicrograph of an area in this purple robe, you can see it's mostly blue, really. And in fact, it does contain ultramarine blue and then an organic red dye. And I think that's most clear if you look at this. There's an abraded area here. I hope you can all see it. And this is telling us that there's probably a blue layer underneath and then a red wash sort of painted over. And that's what gives the purple, the violet color. But it's really not even a mixture, it's a layering of two different pigments. And we know that because of this abrasion here of the upper red layer, which lets the blue layer underneath show through. Now, as I have said, the palette that we identified throughout the manuscript is relatively homogeneous. But this is a complex manuscript. As Stella said, we believe there were 4 different artists at work. So how can we use the technical analysis to really distinguish between them? I guess this is really the typical example of why an experimental protocol for manuscripts analysis can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. In this specific case, it really was the infrared imaging and the XRF analysis that helped us distinguish between the artists. And to underline the importance of the infrared imaging, first, I will briefly compare 2 sets of miniatures which have the same subject matter, but were clearly painted, in fact, clearly sketched in different ways. The first example is based on these 2 annunciations. The first one by the Master of the Bible of Jean-Loup, and the second one by the Master of the Throne of Mercy. These are the corresponding infrared images. And as you can see, both artists used the fluid medium to sketch the composition. The Master of the Bible of Jean-Loup made use of thick hatching to mark the shadowed areas and to provide volume, especially to the folds in the robes. And the thinness and also relative transparency of the paint layers actually allow the drawing to show through in many areas. We really, a lot of these pink and blue layers are so thinly painted and almost transparent that we can see the drawing show through, and that adds to the 3-dimensionality of the final composition. The second artist, on the other hand, drew his annunciation in a much more sketchy manner. Gabriel's wings and his robe are outlined in a very simple way, but very powerful. And despite the fact that the composition is rather schematic and the proportions in a way exaggerated, you can see that both figures have rather large heads, and also God's outstretched arm is really pretty long. But his drawing is beautiful and it's very effective in conveying emotion. Another comparison can be made of the two scenes of the Adoration of the Magi. The first one on the left, painted by the main artist of the grandeur, and then a smaller one painted by one of his assistants. And we can make similar comments in this case. The more accomplished artist uses thick hatching, very similar to what his own master, the master of the Bible, JeanLoup, was doing, to underline the folds, and he draws a much more complex scene overall compared to the one designed by his assistant. The assistant includes some details which look exactly like the ones we see in the larger miniatures, such as the crowns of the kings, and the picks held by the standing king. But his composition is much more simply sketched. And I guess one could argue that the different scale of the miniatures in both pairs, where one is filling up most of the page and the other one is only about 5 centimeters across, may account for the simplicity of the underdrawing in the latter. And this is certainly true in part, but when we start comparing the small miniatures themselves, the unsteady trait of drawing in the Adoration of the Magi, as well as the small facial features of the characters in that miniature, don't produce the same striking image as the one we see in Annunciation on the left. So there is still a difference in style between different artists, even when comparing small miniatures side by side. The near infrared analysis was really interesting also to visualize some small changes in the composition of some of the illuminations. And this is just one of the examples. In this miniature, again, it's one of the small ones by the Master of the Grandeur. We can see that, I hope you can see, that the tree here in the lower right corner was not drawn. It was not sketched before it was painted, whilst the others were. And the artist probably simply felt that the original composition was lacking balance, and so added that tree on the right side to restore it. And this is actually also a nice example of how the small miniatures painted by these artists resemble the large ones, with similar landscapes, similar draperies, both at the drawing and at the painting stage. Now, I did promise that I would show how XRF was especially useful during the analysis of this manuscript, and Stella did say that we had identified small differences in the use of materials by some of the artists, and this is it. A visual observation of the miniatures painted by the Patron of Mercy master showed that he was the only one to make use of a bright red next to orange in his miniatures. And you can see that, I think, a little bit here. I think I've got a magnified image. So you can see there's a very bright red used next to the orange. And the XRF spectra of the orange and red area, they both contain lead, and that's because the orange pigment is red lead, so a lead oxide. But then the spectrum of the red area also contains very large amounts of mercury. And the presence of mercury suggests mercury sulfide, which is vermilion, a bright red pigment. And these, the XRF analysis of not so bright but still red areas in miniatures painted by the other artists did not identify, there was no mercury, no vermilion was identified, suggesting that the reds were obtained by the other artists, usually using either an organic red dye or possibly a diluted brownish iron gall ink. We're not sure yet. But they're definitely not obtaining the same bright red effect and not using the same materials. And then the master of the Coronation book of Charles V, he's the only artist in the Grandeur who makes use of really bright yellows, and he's also the only one to use a different yellow in his grain mixtures. So as I said, all the greens in this manuscript, or most of them, are a mixture of indigo and or piment yellow. This is one of the spectra I showed earlier, which exemplifies that. But if we look at green and yellow areas painted by the master of the Coronation book of Charles V, what we get instead of arsenic is tin, which means he was using Latin yellow, a completely different yellow pigment, much brighter in appearance. And he was mixing that with indigo in these green areas, but he was also using it on its own for bright yellow details, which we don't really find in the miniatures by any of the other artists. There's virtually no yellow, bright yellow in the manuscript. There are some earthy ochre yellow areas in miniatures painted by the other artists, but no bright yellows. So these, in a way, are preliminary suggestions and thoughts about the four artists who contributed to the decoration of the grandeur and the materials they used. And as far as we know, actually, no comparative manuscripts have undergone detailed technical analysis, or at least none that have been published that we can refer to. We really hope the technical analysis of other manuscripts attributed to the Coronation master, for example, would allow for a more reliable characterization of his palette throughout his extended career. Because as Stella said, we're looking at the end of his career now. We don't really know if the use of Latin yellow, for example, is very typical of him throughout his career or not. And it'd be interesting also to analyze manuscripts on which he might have collaborated with the master of the Bible, Jean to try and understand the relationships between these two artists, the degree of exchange, of rivalry, possibly. And we really hope that with this talk today, we have been able to show how a really integrated and cross-disciplinary study of a manuscript can yield a clearer picture of its history and the relationships that exist between the artists who contributed to its decoration. And much research remains to be done on the manuscripts illuminated by these and other artists. And this is what the Miniale project really is setting out to do. We, as you know, all of this research will, we're trying to share with talks, with publications, and also with an online presence, which will grow during the next year as we prepare to launch our new Digital Layers online resource, funded by Arts Council England, which will allow audiences everywhere to explore illuminated manuscripts using a multi-layered approach to reveal both their historical and their artistic importance, as well as their material composition. And again, as all of you I'm sure know, the research undertaken by Miniale will be showcased during a major exhibition here at the Fitzwilliam Museum in 2016 to celebrate the museum's bicentenary and the rich manuscript collection that it holds in all the splendor of its color. Thank you.